These days, Russia and China are considered to be very close allies. Just a few weeks before Russia attacked Ukraine, Chinese leaders and President Putin declared in a meeting that there is a no-limits partnership between China and Russia. Even a year after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, China has not condemned Russia even once. In fact, China has strongly criticized NATO and the United States, accusing them of fueling the conflict by supplying weapons to Ukraine. On the other hand, following the sanctions imposed due to the war, Russia's oil and gas exports to Europe have reduced by almost 80%, which has significantly destabilized the Russian economy. However, during this time, China stepped in and began importing around 60% of its energy resources from Russia. This provided Russia with much-needed cash to sustain its war in Ukraine, and as a result, the bond between the two countries has grown even stronger. But in this video, I'm going to prove that China and Russia are not true allies, but in fact long-standing adversaries, and that the biggest threat to Russia is not the United States, but China itself. This friendship is likely a temporary alliance which may turn into rivalry in the near future. In today's video, I'm going to explain why there is such apparent closeness between China and Russia right now, and why I believe that these two nations are not genuine allies, but are potentially the greatest future threats to each other. This is a very comprehensive video, and I urge you to listen to it carefully until the end, because it reveals many powerful insights related to geopolitics, especially the idea that what appears on the surface in world politics often hides a completely different reality. Since 2020, the relationship building between China and Russia has been highly strategic and planned. At the core, both China and Russia are governed by one-party authoritarian regimes, and for centuries, both have aspired to dominate Europe and Asia. If we talk about Russia, its long-standing ambition has been to control Eurasia, primarily because controlling this region would make it nearly impossible for any Western military to launch an attack on Russia. However, after the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 1990s, Russia lost control of much of this territory. Before Russia's eyes, the areas it once dominated began joining NATO one by one. Only Belarus remained loyal to Russia, while Ukraine and Georgia became major concerns for Moscow. If both Ukraine and Georgia were to join NATO and American or NATO forces were deployed near their borders, it would become much easier for them to reach Moscow. Adjacent to Georgia lies Chechnya, across the Caucasus Mountains, one of Russia's most sensitive regions. Chechnya has already fought two bloody wars with Russia in the 1990s, in which thousands were killed. The Chechen people desired independence, but Russia knew very well that if Chechnya separated, American and NATO forces could enter through Georgia and easily launch an attack on Moscow from there. Therefore, in 2008, Russia invaded Georgia and occupied about 20% of its territory. As a result of this attack, Georgia was unable to become a NATO member. Then in 2014, Russia attacked southern Ukraine and annexed Crimea. And finally, in February 2022, it launched a full-scale invasion of the rest of Ukraine in order to push NATO and US forces back toward Western Europe. Now, China's facing a somewhat similar situation. China's geography is highly complex. It has a 14,000-kilometer-long coastline, the 10th longest in the world, which borders the Pacific Ocean. More than half of China's population lives in coastal regions, and all of China's trade, whether exporting goods to other countries or importing oil and gas, flows through these areas. However, many small islands lie along these maritime routes, such as Taiwan, Japan, the Ryukyu Islands and the Philippines, which create strategic choke points. Unfortunately for China, all of these islands are under strong American influence. They are US allies. At the same time, China's most significant long-term objective is to finally end the civil war that has lingered for the past 70 years and reintegrate Taiwan into the mainland. But the problem is that Taiwan is a close ally of the United States. Technically, it is America's most important non-NATO ally. If China attempts to use military force to take back Taiwan, the US will almost certainly intervene in Taiwan's defense. Moreover, America and its allies could potentially block these choke points, and not just those. Further south, near Singapore, Malaysia, and northern Sumatra, lies a narrow 40-mile stretch of water known as the Strait of Malacca. The US and Indian navies could block this strait, cutting off China's oil and gas supply from the Persian Gulf, which would cripple the country in a matter of days, since 70% of China's energy imports come through this route. So just like Russia, China also believes that the US and its allies are trying to encircle and geographically isolate it. But this growing friendship between China and Russia is not only due to strategic pressure. In reality, both countries are filling each other's gaps and meeting each other's needs. China is the most populous country in the world and has the second largest economy. However, it lacks significant natural resources, which is why China imports around 70% of its energy from abroad. On the other hand, Russia is rich in natural resources, including the world's largest reserves of natural gas, the second largest coal reserves, and the sixth largest oil reserves globally. But Russia's economy and population are much smaller than China's. The most interesting part is that Russia's major natural resources are located in its southern regions, which are some of its least developed and least populated areas. Ironically, these same regions are very close to China's major industrial cities. Now, an understanding has developed between both countries. China will use its capital and labour to exploit these oil and gas reserves and transport them via pipelines into China, while Russia will use the money to fund its war in Ukraine. This benefits both sides. China reduces its dependence on the Persian Gulf and gains a reliable nearby energy supply, while Russia gains steady flow of funds to continue its war efforts. And now we arrive at the point I mentioned earlier, that this friendship is unlikely to last long. To understand why, we need to go back into history. In 1858, China's Qing dynasty was going through serious turmoil. Internally, a violent civil war was raging, leading to massive casualties. Externally, China was engaged in the Opium Wars against Britain and France. Taking advantage of the situation, Russia deployed thousands of troops to the Chinese border and demanded that the Qing dynasty hand over territory or face another war. This region was then known as Outer Manchuria. The Qing government knew it could not survive another war, so in 1860 it signed a treaty surrendering the entire area to Russia. This area of Outer Manchuria later became extremely important to Russia. It includes Russia's largest Pacific port and houses submarine fleets of the Russian Pacific Navy, from where Russia monitors the Pacific Ocean, and particularly the United States. After this treaty, China lost all access to the Sea of Japan. Time passed, and in 1949, Mao Zedong's communists won the Civil War, and the People's Republic of China was established. But the Chinese leadership has never forgotten the 100-year period from 1850 to 1949, during which foreign powers treated the Chinese people with humiliation and exploitation. China refers to this era as the Century of Humiliation, and one of the contributors to that humiliation was Russia itself, which took advantage of China's weakness and seized its land. Chinese leaders have not forgotten what happened in Outer Manchuria. That's why after 1960, relations between China and Russia began to deteriorate when Mao Zedong, during a diplomatic meeting with Japanese officials, made comments stating that Russia had illegally occupied Chinese territory and that even after 100 years, the issue remained unresolved. These comments became public, causing an uproar in Russia. The situation escalated so much that in 1969, Chinese and Russian armies came face to face on the border of Outer Manchuria over the dispute surrounding a small island. For several weeks, the Chinese and Soviet armies fought one another, and dozens of soldiers were killed on both sides. The world's two largest communist nations were now fighting each other, and the conflict was heading toward a potential nuclear war. The Soviets feared that given Mao Zedong's statements, China might attempt to militarily reclaim Outer Manchuria, especially since Russia had only 350,000 troops stationed at the border, while China had 1 million troops, and the only deterrent was the threat of nuclear weapons. Fortunately, the situation did not escalate further, and tensions eventually cooled down. Later, in 1991, Outer Manchuria was officially recognized as part of Russia. However, establishing an official border does not mean China will never attempt to reclaim the territory, especially considering that Russia itself has violated treaties, such as the 1994 and 1997 agreements, when it invaded Ukraine and annexed multiple regions based purely on historical claims. So in the future, China may also attempt to reclaim Outer Manchuria on similar historical grounds. In this century, China is expected to face another major challenge: water shortage. 20% of the world's population lives in China, but the country only has 7% of the world's fresh water. Due to global warming, this water shortage is expected to worsen significantly. In 2022, images from China went viral, showing that one of China's largest rivers had almost completely dried up due to record low rainfall over recent years. The problem for China is that it has very limited options for obtaining fresh water. In this region, most water sources are located in Indian-controlled Himalayan regions, or in Bhutan and Nepal, and China has poor diplomatic relations with all three countries. Now, this is where fortune seems to favour China. In Russian-controlled Siberia, within a mountain range, lies Lake Baikal, the world's deepest and oldest freshwater lake, once mistakenly believed to be a sea. Lake Baikal holds holds so much fresh water that it could sustain the global human population for the next 50 years. China has had its eyes on this lake for a long time. In 2010, the Chinese government began purchasing land around the lake, and by 2017, it announced plans to build a pipeline that would supply water from Lake Baikal to China. However, after this announcement, there was intense backlash from local Russians, who organised widespread protests. In response, the Russian government intervened and shut down the project. But as China's water crisis worsens and Russia's dependence on China grows, the day may not be far off when the Russian government reconsiders and approves the pipeline. Currently, Russia has no choice but to comply with China's demands, because most of the world has imposed sanctions on Russia and its economy is severely struggling. In this context, China's purchase of Russian oil and gas and its provision of labour and financial support is nothing short of a blessing for Russia. On the other hand, China is acquiring oil and gas through a safer and cheaper route and may also gain access to fresh water in the future. Thus, for now, both countries need each other. However, if in the future a new president comes to power in Russia and decides to cancel the water project or increase prices for oil and gas, the Chinese government may once again revisit the issue of Outer Manchuria, and this time China might react much more strongly because China is now a military giant. That's why it's essential to remember. Friendships and international relations are almost always based on mutual interests. In geopolitics, all the shifting alliances you see today are based on necessity. And this brings us to the most important point. It is now necessary for India and Pakistan to also come to the negotiating table and resolve their disputes through non-military means, considering each other's interests. Both countries are rich in natural resources, and if even 50% of their defence budgets were redirected toward healthcare and education, the fate of both nations could transform. We will soon make a video on this topic. If you found today's video informative, please like it and subscribe to the channel. These are all the sources we consulted while making this video. See you in the next video. Take care.